as well to consider trust from what sectors. And youth is a prime example of an area where I think trust is rapidly growing into a state of distrust. And it was a stat I heard on an airplane earlier this morning, so with a little jet lag and perhaps a little bit of a language barrier, if I don't have this exactly right, please excuse me, but 27% of unemployment rate in Spain, focused primarily on 18 to 34-year-olds, to me is not a formula for the youth, for the future of our European survival and European citizens. That level of unemployment can lead to only one of two things. It can either lead to youths becoming thoroughly and personally ambitious, therefore driving entrepreneurism to heights that we've never seen before, or it can go the other way. It can go toward extremism. Right? We see extremism in the US right now with the Tea Party. We see fringes that are becoming something other than fringes as they continue to exercise their influence. That's not something that we want, I would imagine, here in Europe as well. So clearly, civil sector trust in governing structures is at an all-time low. But what about trust in the private sector? What about government or public sector trust in the private sector as well? And there too, I think we rightly have a healthy dose of skepticism. Right? Skepticism that the free market, unencumbered, without regulation, can be able to move our way out of these massive problems that I'm describing. Clearly, there's a key role for the continuance, and if not the continued sharpening, of EU regulation as it relates to how the private sector operates. But therein lies the rub. Does the private sector feel as if it has the right representation in front of the public sector and vice versa to, in fact, get to a point where we can have regulations that greatly reduce the carbon emissions from our factories, that greatly improve youth employment rates throughout the Eurozone and around the world, and that ultimately help solve our math problem that I described earlier. So the private sector is asking itself this same question, which is, can we reasonably expect that the public sector will provide global leadership to address our global challenges? And given the breadth and depth of the challenges that we have in front of us, I truly believe that the only answer is, in fact, collaboration on equal standing across private, public, and civil sectors. Which leads me to our third and final conflict that I want to describe tonight before moving on to how do we move forward? How do we address these conflicts? That third conflict is economic behavior. In the interest of time, because Judith did such a great job describing the dump economy, or what I call the waste economy, I'll instead simply say this. We have an economic behavior battle. It's almost a battle of economic ideology between this notion of use it and lose it versus if we use it and lose it, what we're really losing is money in the process. I was in Finland 2 years ago, giving a talk similar to this. And I asked my host, what % of these plastic bottles that we see in front of us are recycled in Finland? And the number was extraordinary to me, somewhere in the 90% range. I'm blanking on exactly how high, but somewhere in the 90% range. And he asked me in turn, well, what % of the US plastic bottles are in fact recycled? I said I didn't know. I went home and did some research, and it turned out 27% of these plastic bottles are recycled in the US, which means 73% of these plastic bottles are sent to landfill. Did a little bit more calculation. It turns out that by sending 73% of these plastic bottles to landfill, that's a cost of $20 billion each year to the US GDP. Right now, when my government is trying to figure out how to make ends meet, it seems like the waste economy, this idea of use it and dump it, use it and lose it, is not the way to solve the problems in front of us. So what is? Well, Judith talked eloquently about the leasing society. I'm a deep believer and supporter of the concept of leasing in the lease society. And I think the lease society plays a significant role in an alternative economic model that I'm here to present tonight, which is what I call the collaboration economy. Seems like there are certain words in our parlance that are so often used by so many people these days as to risk losing their meaning. The word sustainability, for example, is thrown around by so many people so often that it almost has become meaningless because there's so much noise there. Right now I'm seeing phrases like the sharing economy, the collaborative economy, my notion of the collaboration economy, all being used and used intermittently, and I fear that we run the risk of diluting what is in fact a disruptive and powerful concept that can in fact solve our math and distrust conflicts. So really briefly, what is the collaboration economy? The collaboration economy is a state where we have economic development becoming well aligned with efforts to address and ultimately solve our most vexing environmental and social challenges. And at the risk of redundancy, because these challenges are so massive, whether it's a challenge of population growth, global food system, global water system, I haven't touched on the global energy system yet, let alone the global healthcare system. Because these challenges are so massive, getting public, private, and civil sector collaboration that helps design and then executes a new economic model that in fact aligns growth with efforts to address our environmental and social challenges is of the utmost and desperate importance. But some may ask, do we even need growth? What if we collectively targeted a 0% growth rate? Wouldn't this neutral growth help us at least manage our resource consumption rates so that we wouldn't need to change our production consumption pattern? Some experts have tried to persuasively argue for such a steady state world, a world where we have no additional economic expansion. But I'm here to say that that cannot work. It cannot work not just for the fact that there are obvious humanistic challenges to achieving such a steady state. I mean, how many people really long just to stay where they are? So many people want to be economic and social climbers. So there's that human nature, that human need to move up the chain. But even if the existing population consumed at its current level in perpetuity, we still couldn't achieve a 0% growth rate simply because we have population growth on the docket. Who has the right to say that the 7 billion people living here today have the right to consume as we please, but the 3 billion people to come can't consume at all or can't consume at anywhere near the same levels? So said simply, for the foreseeable future, whether or not we all can agree to the specific words, the pursuit of what I would call necessary or population-driven growth will remain an essential ingredient in our global economic system. So the question then becomes, are we willing to and able to adopt an economic behavior that starts not with the intent of me, but rather with the intent of we? To get from me to we need to figure out how do we bring about this notion of a collaboration economy. And so for this, we need to take two steps. First, we need to briefly look at the evolution in business models over the last decade, and then turn our attention to what efforts and actions I believe, and the CEOs I've had the privilege of counseling over the last 2 years believe the European Parliament can play in helping ensure that we win our common future. You know, there was a time for companies where business was really, dare I say, easy. You identified a consumer need, you identified a way to solve that consumer need, you figured out how to price that product or service for consumers, and you figured out how to create that product or service at a lower price, at a lower cost than the price you charged. You made a profit. Implicit in that formula is that companies could command and control their own destinies. Also implicit in that premise, or that formula, is that the interest of stakeholders, local communities, citizens, all of us sitting here in this room right now, were outweighed by the corporate need to pursue shareholder value creation and shareholder value maximization. But there are many within the private sector that are actually beginning to learn that the extraction of natural resources, use of communal infrastructure, and employment of local community members requires implicit, if not explicit, approval from local communities. Today, business can no longer command and control their own destinies. It's safe to say, and there are a number of CEOs who agree with me, that today, businesses can and best influence and persuade their way to prosperous futures. In fact, there's a group of trailblazing companies that right now is rewriting conventional business thinking to increase their level of influence over their corporate destinies. Think about a company like Coca-Cola, for example. Judith, you and I talked about this really briefly a little bit earlier. But Coca-Cola has realized a very simple formula cannot be overcome. That very simple formula, which highlights its enlightened self-interest, is that without water, there cannot be a product. Without product, there cannot be revenue. And without revenue, there cannot be a company. Therefore, Coca-Cola needs to work very closely with, and has committed to doing so, work very closely with every local community in which it operates to find resources to ensure that the highest amount of clean drinking water is put in every community in which it operates without necessarily having to create any additional environmental impact. Or perhaps better said, we should consider Unilever. We think about Paul Pullman, the chairman and CEO, who in 2010, when he launched the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, indicated that he wanted to double the size of his company while having his environmental footprint. That's analogous to each of us going to the local pub, consuming double our weight in some sort of lager of some sort, and losing half our body mass at the same time. The physics, the numbers, the math doesn't make sense unless you consider this. Pullman is betting on his ability to pull in suppliers, consumers, innovators, rivals, public sector agencies, local community activists, NGOs, and citizens alike to work together to achieve a goal that only 2 or 3 years ago seemed too big for any one company to pursue. Now we run the risk that he hasn't shot high enough. Clearly, there are demonstrable signs that the private sector needs to reinvent their business models all around us. These signs continue to wait to be discovered. Often the evidence resides at the intersection of environmental and social inefficiencies, frequently found in developing countries. Consider the plight of shipping vessels that reach the end of their useful life. Typically, these vessels make their way back to the beaches of developing countries. Thinking Bangladesh is but one example where there are something like a strip of beach that has about 110 or 114 contiguous ship-breaking yards, all of which pull these huge vessels onshore onto the beach where workers who may not necessarily have their rights recognized are provided nothing more than a blowtorch or an axe to strip metal, to strip steel off of these vessels, often at not only incalculable environmental impact, but frankly, unacceptable humanistic impact. So many people lose limbs, lose eyesight, and many hundreds lose their lives. That's why there's a company called Grieg Shipping Group out of Norway that has started to rebuild how it believes the ship-breaking industry should operate. In 2010, it created a group called Grieg Green. It's a for-profit company with responsibility for buying all of its competitors' used vessels